The moment you withdraw your energy, they begin to notice your absence. The instant you stop seeking validation, they wonder why you no longer need it. When you disappear, not physically, but psychologically, they suddenly want to see you. This paradoxical human dynamic isn't just a social curiosity or dating strategy. It reveals something profound about consciousness, power, and the nature of human relationships. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist whose work penetrated deeper into the human psyche than perhaps any other thinker of the 20th century, identified this phenomenon decades ago. But he understood it wasn't merely a quirk of human behavior. It was a manifestation of fundamental psychological principles that operate across all human interactions. Principles that, once understood, transform your understanding of both yourself and others. Jung recognized that the attention, validation, and connection you so desperately seek often remain elusive precisely because you're seeking them. And when you develop the capacity to withdraw this seeking energy, to psychologically disappear, you trigger powerful unconscious responses in others. What looks like a simple case of wanting what you can't have actually reveals sophisticated mechanisms of projection, psychic energy, and unconscious recognition that Jung spent decades mapping. This isn't about manipulation or playing games. It's about understanding the authentic psychological sovereignty that emerges when you no longer depend on external validation for your sense of self. It's about recognizing why psychological withdrawal creates such powerful responses and what this reveals about the deeper structure of human relationships. Most importantly, it's about how this understanding can liberate you from destructive patterns that keep you psychologically dependent on others' responses. Jung's insights into this dynamic weren't just theoretical. They emerged from thousands of hours working with patients trapped in cycles of seeking and disappointment, and from his own journey toward psychological individuation. What he discovered reveals why your disappearance creates presence, and how this paradox might be the key to authentic relationships and genuine self-possession. The economy of attention and validation. To understand why psychological withdrawal creates such powerful effects, we must first recognize what Jung identified as the economy of attention that operates in all human interactions. Unlike material economies where resources are objectively limited, the economy of attention is governed by psychological perceptions of value and scarcity that can shift dramatically based on subtle cues. What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size, Jung observed. This principle operates powerfully in the realm of attention and validation. When you actively seek these psychological goods from others, you signal both your valuation of them and your perceived lack. This creates a classic supply-demand imbalance. Your obvious desire increases the perceived value of what you seek, while simultaneously reducing others' motivation to provide it. Jung understood that this dynamic isn't conscious manipulation on others' part, but an automatic psychological response. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, he noted. The person desperately seeking validation irritates others because they unconsciously recognize their own capacity for similar dependency. This recognition triggers withdrawal rather than engagement. Conversely, when you withdraw your seeking energy, when you psychologically disappear, you disrupt this economic pattern. Your apparent self-sufficiency creates what Jung would recognize as a vacuum in the attentional field, triggering both curiosity and revaluation. Others unconsciously register that what they previously took for granted now appears scarce, increasing its perceived value. Your absence becomes more compelling than your presence was. This shift isn't superficial, but reflects fundamental principles of psychological energy transfer that Jung called libido, using the term more broadly than Freud to indicate psychic energy in general. Where your fear is, there is your task, Jung wrote. When you withdraw the energy previously invested in seeking validation, that energy becomes available for authentic development, creating a genuine shift in your psychological orientation that others sense intuitively. The most powerful aspect of this dynamic is its authenticity when properly understood. This isn't about creating artificial scarcity through manipulation, but about redirecting genuine psychic energy from external seeking to internal development. The response this generates in others isn't manufactured, but emerges naturally from recalibrated perceptions of value and availability. The projection mechanism revealed. Beyond the economy of attention, Jung identified projection as the primary mechanism through which psychological disappearance triggers powerful responses. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances, Jung observed. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When you withdraw psychologically, you alter the chemistry of this interaction in ways that reveal previously invisible projections. Jung defined projection as the unconscious attribution of disowned aspects of oneself onto external objects or persons. When you actively seek validation, you become the perfect screen for others' projections of their own dependency needs and validation-seeking parts. Your obvious desire creates a mirror they unconsciously avoid, limiting engagement rather than enhancing it. By psychologically disappearing, by withdrawing the neediness that facilitated these projections, you create what Jung would recognize as a projection crisis. The material others have unconsciously projected onto you no longer finds a suitable carrier, creating psychological tension that demands resolution. This often leads to efforts to re-engage, to re-establish the projective relationship that previously existed. This mechanism explains why people who showed minimal interest when you pursued them suddenly appear when you move on. It's not mere contrary human nature, but a sophisticated psychological process wherein your withdrawal disrupts established projection patterns. What they're seeking isn't really you, but the aspects of themselves they had comfortably projected onto you, which your disappearance has forced back into uncomfortable consciousness. Jung recognized this pattern in therapeutic relationships as well. Patients often made the greatest breakthroughs precisely when the therapist withdrew active intervention, creating space for autonomous psychological movement. The shoe that fits one person pinches another, Jung noted. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. Psychological withdrawal creates space for authentic engagement precisely because it disrupts prescriptive patterns of interaction. The projection mechanism works most powerfully when your psychological disappearance is genuine rather than tactical. When you authentically redirect energy from external validation to internal development, you not only become unavailable as a projection screen, but begin emanating a quality of self-possession that triggers entirely different projections. Others now project potential value and mystery, where they previously projected neediness and dependence. The unconscious recognition of strength. Jung's understanding of the collective unconscious, the shared psychological substrate that connects all humans, explains perhaps the most interesting aspect of the disappearance phenomenon. Why authentic psychological sovereignty attracts while neediness repels, even when neither is explicitly expressed. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, Jung wrote. When you develop genuine psychological self-sufficiency, you're not just changing conscious behaviors, but altering unconscious patterns that others register without conscious awareness. Your reduced psychic dependence registers as strength at this unconscious level, triggering instinctive attraction rather than calculated interest. This operates through what Jung identified as archetypes, universal patterns within the collective unconscious that shape perception and response. The self-possessed individual activates archetypal patterns associated with wisdom, power, and completion. The validation-seeking individual activates archetypal patterns associated with childhood dependency and incompletion. These activations occur automatically, below the threshold of conscious perception. The unconscious recognition explains why psychological sovereignty can't be effectively faked. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, Jung observed. Genuine psychological independence emerges from integrating disowned aspects of yourself, including the needy, dependent parts, rather than suppressing them. Others unconsciously distinguish between this authentic integration and strategic withdrawal because they activate different archetypal responses. This distinction matters because it explains why genuine self-development creates magnetic attraction, while tactical, playing hard to get, generates only superficial and transient interest. The former activates deep archetypal recognition of psychological wholeness, while the latter triggers only tactical counter-responses. Jung would recognize this as the difference between individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, and persona adaptation, the mere adjustment of social masks. When you disappear psychologically through authentic self-development, you don't just become temporarily interesting. You activate unconscious recognition of a different mode of being. This explains why individuals who have done genuine psychological work often attract intense interest without actively seeking it. They embody archetypal patterns of wholeness that register unconsciously as both mysterious and desirable. The paradox of presence through absence. Jung's work consistently explored paradoxes within the human psyche, and the phenomenon of presence through absence exemplifies these contradictory truths. In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order, he wrote. The apparent contradiction of becoming more present through disappearance reveals a deeper psychological order operating beneath surface appearances. When you're psychologically absent, no longer seeking validation or reaction, you create space for genuine presence to emerge. This paradox operates through several mechanisms Jung identified. First is the dissolution of the persona, the social mask, that occurs when you stop performing for others' responses. This dissolution reveals what Jung called the authentic personality, which possesses a quality of presence impossible to achieve through deliberate self-presentation. Second is the integration of shadow material that occurs when you withdraw the energy previously used to maintain appearances. Jung defined the shadow as disowned aspects of the self, and noted that integration of this material creates psychological substance that others unconsciously register. Your shadow integration creates a gravity that draws others toward your more complete self, even as your conscious attention moves away from seeking their engagement. Third is the activation of the self-archetype, Jung's term for the organizing center of the entire personality that transcends the ego. When you withdraw ego-driven seeking behavior, you create space for this deeper dimension of personality to emerge. Others respond not just to your absence, but to the qualitative shift in what remains present, a presence emanating from beyond the personal ego. This explains why spiritual traditions worldwide include practices of withdrawal and silence. These aren't merely tactical maneuvers, but methods for shifting from ego-centered to self-centered consciousness. Jung recognized these traditions as maps of psychological transformation rather than mere religious practices, noting their consistent emphasis on withdrawal as path to authentic presence. The paradox finds practical expression in relationships. When you stop managing others' perceptions and reactions, you become capable of genuine connection rather than mere interaction. You're fully present rather than strategically engaged. This authentic presence attracts others far more powerfully than the most skillful social performance, because it activates archetypal recognition of wholeness and truth. The authentic development of inner strength. Jung distinguished between power and strength in ways relevant to understanding the disappearance phenomenon. Power, in his framework, operates externally through influence over others and circumstances. Strength operates internally through psychological sovereignty and integration. The former depends on external conditions. The latter exists independent of circumstances. Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling, Jung wrote. This integration of previously divided aspects of the psyche creates what he recognized as genuine inner strength, not the mere suppression of weakness or dependency, but their incorporation into a more complete self. This strength emerges naturally when you withdraw the energy previously invested in seeking external validation. The development happens through what Jung called active imagination, the conscious engagement with unconscious material. Rather than merely abstaining from external seeking, you redirect that energy toward understanding and integrating the psychological dynamics driving the seeking behavior. This integration creates genuine self-sufficiency rather than tactical withdrawal. This explains why authentic psychological disappearance creates such different results from simply playing hard to get. The latter is a strategic repositioning within the same psychological framework of dependency, while the former represents transcendence of that framework entirely. Others unconsciously recognize and respond to this qualitative difference rather than the mere behavioral similarity. The inner strength that develops through this process creates what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to respond to psychological development rather than causal action. Opportunities, relationships, and circumstances align with your authentic development, not through magical thinking, but through enhanced perception and readiness. You notice and respond to possibilities your previous seeking behavior would have obscured. This principle extends beyond personal relationships to professional and creative domains. The writer who stops seeking validation often produces their best work. The professional who stops anxiously managing perceptions often advances more naturally. The artist who abandons concern for reception often creates their most powerful art. In each case, the disappearance of seeking behavior corresponds with the emergence of authentic strength. The dance of engagement and withdrawal. Jung's understanding of psychological dynamics wasn't static but cyclical, recognizing natural rhythms of engagement and withdrawal. Everything good is costly, and the development of personality is one of the most costly of all things, he wrote. This development requires strategic withdrawal of energy, but its ultimate expression includes renewed engagement from a transformed position. The disappearance that triggers others' interest isn't meant to be permanent, but transitional, a phase in psychological development rather than an endpoint. Jung recognized that complete withdrawal, while sometimes necessary for development, ultimately contradicts the relational nature of human consciousness. The goal isn't permanent disappearance, but engagement from authentic self-possession. This creates what Jung might recognize as a dance between withdrawal and engagement, between psychological independence and connection. You withdraw not to manipulate others' interest, but to develop authentic self-possession. This self-possession then enables genuine connection without dependency, creating relationships based on mutual recognition rather than mutual need. The dance appears in all meaningful relationships. Parents must psychologically disappear at appropriate developmental stages, creating space for a child's autonomous development. Partners must maintain psychological sovereignty while choosing connection. Friends must respect appropriate boundaries while cultivating genuine sharing. In each case, the rhythm of presence and absence creates the conditions for authentic relationship. Jung observed this pattern in the therapeutic relationship as well. The effective therapist must be fully present while maintaining appropriate psychological boundaries. They must engage authentically while avoiding dependency. Most importantly, they must disappear at the right moments, creating space for the client's autonomous development. This calibrated disappearance often precipitates the most significant breakthroughs. The principle extends to leadership contexts. The most effective leaders maintain psychological independence while remaining fully engaged. They don't seek validation from those they lead, but operate from internal authority. This sovereignty creates natural respect precisely because it doesn't demand it, exemplifying the paradox of presence through psychological self-possession. The liberation of psychological sovereignty. The ultimate significance of Jung's insights into psychological disappearance isn't tactical, but liberatory. The capacity to withdraw energy from external validation creates freedom from one of the most pervasive forms of psychological dependency. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, Jung wrote. This acceptance creates the foundation for authentic sovereignty. The liberation operates through several mechanisms Jung identified. First is freedom from projection dependency, the unconscious reliance on others to carry disowned aspects of yourself. When you withdraw the energy previously invested in maintaining these projections, you reclaim the psychological material they contained. This reclamation creates wholeness previously sought through others' responses. Second is freedom from what Jung called participation mystique, the unconscious blending of psychic boundaries between yourself and others. When you establish psychological sovereignty, you gain the capacity to engage without losing your distinct identity. You can connect authentically, precisely, because you don't depend on connection for self-definition. Third is access to what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to reconcile opposing elements and generate new consciousness. When you withdraw from external validation seeking, you create the internal space necessary for this function to operate. Contradictions that previously seemed irresolvable find integration through this natural psychological movement. This liberation transforms relationships rather than eliminating them. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances, Jung observed. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When you engage from sovereignty rather than need, you create the conditions for mutual transformation rather than mutual dependency. The relationship becomes generative rather than compensatory. The freedom extends beyond relationships to life direction and purpose. Jung noted that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This becoming requires periodic psychological disappearance, withdrawal from external definitions and expectations to discover authentic internal direction. The clarity that emerges often attracts support precisely because it doesn't seek it, creating alignment between internal purpose and external opportunity. Perhaps most importantly, psychological sovereignty liberates you from the exhausting work of impression management. When you no longer depend on others' responses for self-definition, You can engage authentically without calculation. This authenticity conserves enormous psychological energy previously invested in managing perceptions, making it available for creative and generative purposes. The sovereignty beyond disappearance. The phenomenon of others wanting to see you when you disappear ultimately points toward something beyond the dynamic itself, a mode of being that transcends both seeking and withdrawal. Jung recognized this transcendent possibility as the ultimate goal of psychological development, a state where neither engagement nor disappearance is tactical, because both emerge naturally from authentic presence. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart, Jung wrote. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. This awakening creates a quality of presence that neither demands nor withdraws attention, but simply is. Others respond to this authentic being precisely because it doesn't seek response, creating relationships based on recognition rather than need. The state doesn't eliminate the human need for connection and recognition, but transforms how these needs express themselves. Rather than seeking validation to fill an internal void, you engage from internal fullness that naturally extends toward others. This engagement creates connection without dependency, allowing both complete sovereignty and complete presence. Jung recognized this transformed engagement as the hallmark of individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people, he observed. This knowing creates the foundation for authentic connection that doesn't require either desperate seeking or tactical withdrawal. The sovereignty beyond disappearance involves a fundamental shift in orientation, from having relationships to being in relationship. The former treats connection as something to acquire and maintain through tactical management. The latter recognizes relationship as the natural expression of authentic presence. Others want to see you not because you've disappeared, but because you've appeared more fully than ever before. This ultimate state doesn't eliminate the paradox, but embodies it. You become simultaneously most yourself and most connected, most sovereign and most engaged. The disappearance that others find so compelling becomes not a strategic withdrawal, but the natural absence of false seeking, creating space for genuine presence that attracts precisely because it doesn't need to. But there's another dimension to this phenomenon that even Jung only partially articulated, a level where psychological sovereignty intersects with collective consciousness in ways that transform not just individual relationships, but entire social systems. This dimension explains why the disappearance dynamic operates not just interpersonally, but culturally, and why genuine psychological liberation has implications far beyond personal relationships.